Kia ora te whānau and welcome. If you have photos from Oniimwandi in the 80s, you're looking at a paradox. Maybe even you remember what it looked like back then. You know, you see a military base, sure, you see the Casspirs, the dust, the camouflage, but then you see the juvenile elephants in a log enclosure. You see the ostrich and the wildebeest, the snakes and pythons dumped into the porta pool people were swimming in as a joke, that the base captain thought was hilarious. I was billeted there along with some other fresh Corp graduates when we first arrived in Oniimwandi. It looked like a sanctuary, but as any of us who spent any time there will tell you, Oniimwandi had a shadow, and that shadow was shaped like a lion. Oniimwandi was a bizarre, dusty version of Noah's Ark. We had two juvenile elephants that were like the base's heartbeat, these grey ghosts that would drift around past your window while you were cleaning a kit. There was a baboon enclosure that was a permanent fixture of chaos, basically. A large python enclosure in the shadows, and a wildebeest that seemed convinced that it was actually one of the guys. We had a teammate, Maurice was his name. He wore these thick glasses. I don't know why this juvenile wildebeest took a real disliking to him, but every time Maurice stepped out of one of those prefab bungalows, this thing would charge him, and he'd have to grab it by the horns and prevent it doing damage. But the bigger it got, the more difficult it became for Maurice to do that. So it ended up one day he loaded some rock salt into a 12-gauge shotgun shell and really discouraged that wildebeest of ever wanting to attack him again. It was a surreal existence. You'd be prepping for a night ambush and you'd have to shoo an ostrich away from your webbing. It felt like we were living in the bush, not just fighting in it. Now the Casspir was our world, right? But it was a clumsy 15-ton giant. I remember one afternoon backing one up to hook up a water bowser to it. And you're looking backwards through these thick armor glass plate windows, maneuvering a mountain of steel, basically. And in hindsight, it would have been wise to pop open the rear hydraulic doors to be, have been able to see a bit better. There was this vulture in camp, one of the captain's favourite animals, right? It had fallen asleep in the sun, tucked its head beneath its wing, completely oblivious. I didn't see it, I didn't feel it. A 15-ton tyre doesn't feel a bird. It was only when I hopped down and saw the mess, the scavenger, a master of the African sky, had been crushed in its sleep by the very machine that kind of defined our lives, It was a metaphor for the whole war, two worlds colliding and the natural world usually losing. But the most famous resident of Oniimwandi it wasn't the elephants, it was the lion in the cage. While we were out tracking, Captain Sakkie Ballach and his team were back at the office. The interrogation centre was the clinical quiet end of the machine, and the lion was part of that machine. Its cage was positioned so that anybody being led to questioning had to pass it. Imagine being a captured insurgent, right, exhausted and broken, walking past a pacing 400-pound predator in the dead of night. The psychological weight of that roar, a sound that vibrates in your chest, was worth more than any physical threat. The strangest part was the transition. Sunday afternoon would roll around and the Zulu teams would start up the evening braais. The smell of the leadwood smoke and sizzling meat would start drifting across the base. Yeah, we'd sit there with our White Horse whiskey, laughing, telling stories of the bush, trying not to think about the morning when we'd have to roll out again. But in the background, you'd hear the lion pacing, you'd hear the low, hushed voices of Ballach's team coming from the interrogation blocks. You'd be holding a glass of whiskey in one hand while, 5 metres away, the darker side of war was unfolding in the silence. We were the hunters, but at Oniimwandi we were also the keepers of the predators. Looking back at those, at those photos now, the elephants look so innocent, the baboons look like pranksters, but I can still feel the vibration of that lion's roar and the weight of that Casspir tyre. Oniimwandi wasn't just a base, it was a place where the camaraderie of the Zulu teams met the cold reality of intelligence work. It was where the Ark met the office, and for those of us that were there, the shadow of that lion never quite goes away. Anyway, team, thanks for listening. Thanks for watching. Ka kite anō. I'll see you all next time.